Hello, welcome to today's VesselBot webinar, the BAF Black Box Navigating Surcharges in an Era of Disruption. We will start in 1 minute. Welcome again. Thank you for joining. I am Maria Bena, Communications Manager at VesselBot, and I'm pleased to welcome listeners from around the world. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. All participants are muted. You can share your questions by sending them through the comments box. After our speakers conclude their conversation, we will address all the audience's questions in the Q&A session. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all who are registered along with the presentation. A few words about who we are. VesselBot is a technology company that bridges the gap between ambitious emission targets and actionable execution strategies. We help logistics, sustainability, and supply chain professionals who have clear sustainability deadlines and targets, but need a roadmap to achieve them cost-effectively. Our logistics intelligence platform transforms transportation and supply chain data into precise optimization that reduce both emissions and operational costs simultaneously, providing data-driven insights showing exactly which operational improvement will hit your targets while delivering a return on investment. And without further ado, let me introduce you to our speakers. Bart A is an industry expert and thought leader with over 30 years of supply chain and logistics experience across the globe. Bart has worked for major international companies such as EY, GE Capital, Penske Logistics, PepsiCo, as well as several tech companies. Bart spent 8 years as a VP of Research at Gartner and served as a Chief Industry Officer at Project 44. Bart is a sought-after speaker who is currently advising multiple companies and industry organizations in logistics. Constantine Komodromos is the founder and CEO of VesselBot. With over 24 years of experience working in multinational organizations and building startups, Constantine brings a unique perspective as a fellow member of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. He's seen firsthand how companies struggle with the gap between sustainability ambitions and operational reality. Bart, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Maria. Now, I want to upfront kind of set a clear goal of what we want to talk about today. And we really want to learn why shippers are absorbing massive surcharge exposure really without a factual basis to verify if those charges reflect actual voyage execution. And we will also discover how digital twins and independent simulation models can verify fuel consumption, vessel specifics, and actual route patterns. And that's moving beyond the carrier spreadsheet. But why is this so important right now? We all know that the global shipping market has transitioned from temporary volatility into what we can call a permanent state of disruption. And we're no longer waiting for a return to normal. Instead, we all have to navigate a landscape that's defined by continuous structural uncertainty and constant geopolitical friction. Now, the main reason for today's discussion is driven by several critical shifts in global trade lanes that have made traditional pricing models a liability. First, we see all of the Strait of Hormuz reroutings. And we all know that following military strikes in early this year, that the Strait has remained effectively closed to commercial traffic, forcing almost 70% of vessels to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. This typically adds 10 to 14 days of transit time and thousands of miles of additional fuel consumption. But this disruption has triggered a wave of unpredictable costs. Brent crude has exceeded $100 per barrel. I think today the high price is $103.36. And that's leading major carriers like Maersk and MSC to implement emergency fuel surcharges and war risk premiums on top of already elevated base rates. Now, bunker adjustment factors have become the final frontier of what we could call opaque pricing. Currently, carriers define the math and consumption metrics without any independent validation. And this puts all the power on the carrier side, and it leaves many of you shippers powerless. And this lack of transparency is impacting both larger shippers, but also medium-sized shippers who might have some data but aren't sure what to do with it when they're discussing these with their carriers. So the goal of this webinar is truly to explore how you can transition from reactive firefighting to transparency, using independent simulation to secure a factual reference point for most of your volatile shipping costs. And this can be used by shippers in discussions with their carriers to provide pushback to higher rates and improve procurement negotiation. So with that, let's dive into how we can move beyond the carrier spreadsheet and focus on actual costs in order for us to make better decisions. So Constantine, let's start by explaining what bunker adjustment factors truly are.
Look, Bart, thank you for the very well documented intro. All of us that are in the market know that, especially in periods where there is a lot of volatility with the fuel prices, carriers tend to add additional charges on top of existing fuel surcharges that they add. They call it emergency fuel surcharges, emergency bunker surcharges, and there are a number of different names around it. Mostly it is for them to recoup the cost associated to the extra fuel costs, or at least that is what is being described when they add these costs. Usually are connected to a Platts index of bunker prices, and they mention that into their notices of price adjustments. And that means that this is a quite different number that is being quoted by each one of those. It might even be same vessel operated by one carrier, but is shared in between different carriers, and the price might be different. The freight surcharge might be different on each carrier, from each carrier to their customers, for a number of reasons. I guess that has to do with their pricing policies. Therefore, because there is no transparency into this, we see quite a lot of questions coming from shippers on how they can manage these. Why are these costs? What is driving these costs? And recently I was on a webinar, to be honest, and the CEO of a large carrier was saying the cost is not merely driven by only the bunker prices, but is also driven by other factors. Some of those are those that you described: reroutings, increased speeds, lower utilizations of the TU. So there are a lot of factors impacting, and apparently having that bunker price cost only as an indication cannot interpret these costs and cannot enable any understanding of how or where they are going or how they are driven by the carriers. So
I think, Constantine, in the example that we see here in front of us, right? So I think the issue really is that shippers only see that one number, right? In this case, that BAF factor, it's 1,000, but they don't really understand what's behind it. They don't have access to all 7 of those different components that make that up, which also then means you don't really know how to attack that, whether it's like, can we change it or can we negotiate it, or how do we go and have that discussion with the carrier? So how does that really create kind of issues on the shipper side, not having transparency to that data?
As most of the carriers, they just accept it. So some, as most shippers, it is just an exercise where they go, okay, where we supposed to be charged, where we charge this amount that it is in the public notices. However, there are some shippers that started doing some discussions because they feel that these costs are quite high and they are significantly fluctuating their freight cost and are increasing their freight cost. The problem which most of the shippers are faced with is the fact that they don't have that visibility of the data, of the underlying data, as you mentioned. So that underlying data that drives fuel consumption, extra fuel costs, are not visible to the majority of the market. And this is because there hasn't been a solution that has provided that granularity to enable this kind of information, because not many organizations in the market are offering the fuel consumption data. The fuel consumption data, as you may understand, is quite sensitive information that the carriers are holding. And as a result, it is not something that you can openly in the market find or ask the carrier, can you give me your fuel consumption or your TU utilization, and they'll give you. So it is a situation now where shippers are faced with high costs. They don't have any data to substantiate any factual negotiation, and they just push back a bit. In many cases, there is some consideration of the repercussions that might be there. We are a smaller, we've heard from the market in some cases, we are a smaller player, how can we negotiate these? We want to make sure that our cargo is on the vessel, and we don't want to disturb our supply chain. So these are valid, by the way, arguments and considerations that each logistics person needs to make. However, if you don't have any data, you cannot negotiate anything at all. So you are obliged in a way, given the whole context of things, to accept the cost and stay there.
Yeah, and it's a good point, right, Constantine? Because on the over-the-road side, we've done it for a couple of decades where we really started looking into what is the true cost of fuel when we talk about a truckload going from point A to point B. But on the ocean side, it's still to this day kind of a black box. But now, because of the reroutings, because of the incredibly high fuel prices, this is not just impacting the logistics manager who sees their budget overrun, but now also the CFO of companies, because that high transportation cost is really starting to impact the cost of goods sold, and it's even making that cost of goods sold unpredictable. So Constantine, in your conversations with these shippers, why do you think this is really should be, if it isn't, why should it be a top priority for organizations to look into this?
I think there are a few reasons why this is the case, Bart. And by that I mean some shippers, or at least some shippers, have started trying to manage this cost even before now, with other mechanisms or whichever data source they could get their hands on. Some we've heard from a shipper that we've built our own methodology that we work with the carrier, and the carrier has accepted it. So there was always, in the last few years, there were a lot of cases where these costs hit the P&L of companies and increased significantly the freight cost. But as you said, we see this happening in a prolonged form now and for a prolonged period. And to a large extent, companies have started realizing that this can impact not just now, but also in a few months' time, or it started becoming something more regular. So they started recognizing a need to manage that cost, to manage that risk, and looking around to find reasons, or rather the way to manage it. Now, from what we see in the market, a lot of companies have not realized what the cost, the additional cost is, and how much this is impacting their baseline. And this is something we usually do with our customers to show them that, their exposure, because there are cases where you may have, given lanes, $1,500 extra. $1,500 extra is a quite substantial amount of money on top of your freight cost. So that can significantly alternate your cost in some, at least, markets. For some others, no. But nonetheless, this is becoming a substantial cost element that companies are looking to manage, and this is the reason I think that there is a drive now in the market from many shippers to start acting upon data, negotiating with their freight forwarders, with their carriers, these kind of costs.
Bart, you're
We can't
muted.
hear you. Yeah. Technology apparently sometimes fails us, but that's okay. I'm sure that Bart will manage soon to get back to us with a new setting.
All right, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry about that. It's something on the platform that doesn't like my microphone. So, Constantine, with now having kind of said what's the real challenge, what's the problem, why should this be a priority for companies? Let's go and focus now on the solution, right? Because we want to get to how can we be ahead of this, stay ahead of this, so we can avoid these huge costs. So, two questions to you: what data do we need, and how does VesselBot provide the data? Because we talk here about 7 different sources of data. Many of those a shipper typically does not have access to. And then how does the VesselBot platform really work to quickly provide insights into what we call the real fuel costs?
Okay, so, and it's a great question in the sense that it connects 2 dots, Bart. It connects the dot of sustainability, which is what the underlying is the product that we have, our sustainability platform. However, the way that we've been doing emissions calculations for goods being shipped with third-party assets, with carriers, has always been the same way that one can estimate fuel consumption. So what we do is we've built a digital twin for every vessel, ocean-going vessel. So for every vessel, we have their engine characteristics, their propeller, their design, their TEU, their draft. We know a lot of information about the vessel itself. On the other hand side, we collect satellite and terrestrial AIS data, GPS data. So geospatial data on how the vessel is moving, their speeds, how much time they're staying outside of the port, how much time they're spending inside the port limits doing operations. So practically any information related to the vessel, the operational patterns, and also the weather that it comes along its route. So it moved from the Med to Canada, the specific cargo. The port codes that it did were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. To do that, it sailed with 14.5 knots on average. We have different intervals of speeds. The distance sailed was X. So all the information exists on our database. With that, what we can do is we can simulate fuel consumption with very high accuracy, more than 97% accurate compared to actual. So what that means is we are able to measure the total fuel consumption of the vessel, and then we also know how many containers, TEU, are being carried on each voyage from each vessel. So that means that we have all the operational patterns, the fuel consumption, and as a result, the number of containers that is being carried. All these together with the bunker prices allow us to provide that granularity of how which should be the cost that should be allocated to surcharges based on the actual parameters of the vessel, of the ocean schedule, of the trade lane, of the carrier, you name it.
Yeah, very good. So, and I think, as you mentioned, right, there can be a fairly large gap between what you would estimate these costs to be versus the actual, right, based on actual speed, the routes, etc. And so that mechanism that you just described, right, it really provides shippers what you can call kind of an independent reference point or a benchmark that the shippers can use. How does that benchmark kind of change the dynamic from kind of that confrontation with the carrier where you really don't have access to the data, to moving towards collaboration between shippers and carriers and really having a discussion about it?
Look, and you're raising a nice point here, because what we want to achieve is not any confrontation or whatever. We know that this is an ecosystem, and the ecosystem just needs to operate in a way that is fair to all of the sides. What we want to be is an independent benchmark where both the carrier, if needed, and the shipper can have a constructive discussion around the charges and identify, the shippers identify which are those lanes, service schedules that they should be paying attention. We are not saying that all carriers on all lanes are overcharging or undercharging or whatever. There might be cases and lanes that they are overcharging. There might be that they are undercharging. You are utilizing some of those that are undercharged or overcharged. So it is the mechanism to enable the understanding within the organization of the shippers of where they stand and where they could be having this constructive discussion, a factual-based discussion with their carrier, and find that middle ground where, yes, this might be the case, but we see that we should then be charged with X amount of money for this and this a reason. Should we reach to a conclusion that the cost should be X lower? Yes, no, and that becomes a kind of more a collaborative discussion, not a confrontational one. Data-driven, always substantiated.
Yeah. And I think we talked about the benchmark. You made a reference earlier to, hey, we have this route from the Mediterranean to Canada. Here's a practical example. Can you walk us, Constantine, through that of what that really means, right? If we're having these big surcharges, we have a lot of containers on these ships, what that potential is, and based on real use cases that you have with your customers.
Okay, so basically what you have, so we start from where our customers are active on, or it can be our customers look into our platform and they check their own service lanes, schedules, whichever that might be on a carrier basis or whatever. And they recognize that there is a discrepancy between what the carrier is charging and what our data suggests. And that becomes the starting point. The starting point is we recognize that on this lane, these 5 lanes, we have an overcharge of X percentage. How do we look into the data? We look into the data, they can work with us or independently. They look into the data and they decide whether they want to negotiate that with their freight forwarder or their carrier. And that becomes a matter of how they approach the topic in a cumulative way. We have 5 lanes with you, 5 services with you that we're working. These 5 services, we identify these discrepancies per our data provider. These are the substantiation. This is the substantiation of how this calculation was done from our provider. There is complete visibility over everything on our side. People can see how we've been doing the calculation, the fuel consumptions, the utilizations, the speeds, the distances, the port calls, the map, the route, everything. So it gives you that granularity where you start identifying the lanes that you have a problem, in inverted comma problem. You go and screen through the data. You go back to your freight forwarder if you're working with a freight forwarder, to the carrier independently, and you start this process where you engage to discuss that. This is an example where you can see an FMCG company that has Med to Canada, is using a Med to Canada service. They have around 1,000 FEU reefers. The fuel surcharge for that, the emergency and the normal fuel surcharge was around $1,000. We were estimating around less per container, and based on the 1,000 containers, that is the potential they could be negotiating with their customers. What we are seeing as a pattern is that as a bare minimum, there can be at least 15 to 20% saving from these kind of negotiations that are happening with data, with their carriers or their freight forwarders. Probably not at the specific instance, but on the next contracts, because there are cases where you have already fixed contracts that you cannot do outright changes, but nonetheless, these savings have been materialized from our customers' wells.
Yeah, Constantine, that brings up a really good point, right? Because we want to put the data in action. We don't just want to say, oh, this is what we could have saved. How do we actually go and save it? So how do we take this independent benchmark and really push it into the negotiation table during that next tender cycle? And how do we truly turn the information that you provide in your platform as part of the whole procurement process? How should companies practically look at that in using it when they go and have those procurement discussions with their carriers?
That depends whether they are booking spot or they close the fixed contracts. Depending on each and whether they work with freight forwarders as well, because as you may understand, these are different. There are different angles on how you need to approach that. One thing that we usually suggest is we have indexes that are market related, trade lane market related, not carrier specific. So for those indices that we publish, we suggest to our customers to include those into their contracts as a mechanism instead of the Platts bunker price. So instead of having only the bunker price to enable any BAF charges, on our end, we suggest that in the contracts they utilize our indexes so that they get a better, more independent index, so that they are being charged along that, based on that. On the spot markets, as you may understand, this is something that they can screen through our platform in real time. The platform is being updated constantly so that you can collect data before booking and understanding whether this market is this carrier is volatile, which carrier has a lower rate in comparison to others, and a number of things, so that you can preventively fix with your carriers, taking into consideration this cost along any other parameter that you are taking into consideration: freight cost, reliability, emissions, so on and so forth.
Yeah, very good. And I want to remind the audience, the attendees, that hey, if you have any questions, please go in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, push on that and provide us your questions. We will get to those in a little bit. Now, Constantine, obviously, once we have that now in the contract, that also is going to help us to kind of get away from just blindly paying the invoice and not knowing really if we've overpaid or not, to kind of improve auditability and making sure that we're paying according to the details in the contract. What's the value for companies there, and how does that truly improve auditability? And I think as a CCA, that's very important for you as well, right?
I was going to touch upon it. I'm coming from a finance background, and finance people usually want to be able to exactly look at the audit trail and understand why these charges are coming and what is driving them. On the other hand side, you want to be able to make the necessary provisions, accruals in your accounting as a CFO, or even as a logistics person, knowing what the cost that you should be incurring in the near future. And on the other hand side, it is the risk management part, because without having this visibility or potential visibility, you cannot manage the risk of the cost increases as well. So being able to do that and have that visibility can also enable you to manage the risk in finance ways, if you like, in a sense.
Yeah, very good. Now, I think what's really important as well is for people to really understand the full benefit of this approach, right? So what are some of the benefits that people can really get from it, and who all in the process gets benefit? Because it's not just one part of the organization, it's really in different parts, I think, as is laid out in the slide that's on the screen here.
Yes, correct, because it starts from procurement of freight, and freight procurement people in many ways can benefit from that, because you have this independent fuel surcharge data service that you can base any decisions on. You can look into the future trends of these based on the market prices, based on the patterns of the vessels and executions and all these kind of things. On the other hand side, operational teams can see the potential effects in their cost, can see if they book something today and it moves into a dispatch date, that the cost will increase, what that might be increasing, what we call slippage, what the cost might be on their P&L, how these reroutings are impacting not just their operational side of things, but also the cost and the supply chain overall cost and the cost of goods sold. Finances, I was explaining before, sustainability people can also get an understanding of the different potential of changes with alternative fuels, or and what that would mean with that regards. So there are a lot of potential benefits for different job roles within both the transportation, logistics teams, as well as finance and sustainability teams.
Very good. And I'm happy to see that sustainability plays a role here as well. So how does fuel consumption benchmarking align with Scope 3 carbon reporting, Constantine? Because I would say it's not something to be overlooked.
Look, as I was saying, we believe in having good quality data. And good quality data, as you may understand, the same scope of reporting of emissions, Scope 3 emissions, transportation, can enable also you getting this kind of additional data, because the same data and the same initiatives that you do to get highly granular executional level of emissions data enables the same type of detail and granularity on the fuel surcharges management. So the same initiative, although it might not be that visible, I'll do sustainability, and in the end I'll end up being able to manage my cost in a sense, freight cost in a sense. Although it is not that clear, it is in the aftermath, and what happens based on the data is very clear, because you will see those data streamed throughout the organization. And as I was explaining, either this is sustainability for sustainability initiatives, or this is freight cost and operational efficiencies, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a risk, right? If you don't have those details, that it can actually kind of undermine your credibility from a decarbonization perspective, because the emissions measurement that you're actually using is even further incorrect because of some of those factors, standard factors, if you use those. So as we're going to get close to the question. So if you have a question for myself or Constantine, please put it in the Q&A section. But Constantine, so if we want to go ahead and do this, what role do shippers need to play versus maybe what they're playing now? And how should they approach this, right? How should they look at things like data to really get benefits out of the solution?
Look, I think from what we see in the market and from what we heard from the market, more and more logistics executives believe that this is not something that will change. Not the current situation, it might change at some point of time, but what we see is a repetitive pattern of disruptions, and the repetitive pattern of disruptions means again and again we'll be faced with this kind of cost. So if you never start managing these kind of costs or setting up the processes and procedures and the data layer that you need to start managing it, you will never manage it. Maybe this time this will go, but in a few months' time, that when it happens again, this will hit your P&L, and it will be a constant battle for you to keep up with the cost and manage it. So if you don't start now, this will hit you in the future. So starting from somewhere, even with the basics, it would definitely give you a starting point and understanding and a baseline of how you can work with carriers, start engaging with them, because as you know, changes in our market do take a bit of time. So unless you start early, you will definitely feel the heat again in the next wave of these disruptions and the extra cost that you will incur.
Yeah, very good. So to that point, Constantine, do you think the industry is ready for this fuel surcharge benchmarking, or are bespoke simulations the only way forward?
Ready or not, Bart. I mean, we said that in the sense that, and I can see a question along those lines. If we don't do, is what I was saying before, there are different stances that you can take. Wait and see, I'll be a forward runner, I'll be a late runner. What do I do is something that has to do with each of the organizations. However, I believe that more and more, and this is what we see, the appetite is there. It's just a matter of companies starting from somewhere. Not because there is no ideal situation, there is no perfect situation unless you start laying the layers and the groundwork to enable you to build on top of that. So if we don't start anywhere from somewhere, we'll never reach to that point where we want. And to answer to Josh's question, willing to partner or provide data, we don't see that happening, Josh. And this is why companies are looking for, shippers are looking for this kind of data from organizations like VesselBot. Utilization, to some extent, is a commercial parameter. You can get it in a more aggregated form, not on a service level maybe, or even on a vessel level. And this is something that neither the fuel consumption, not in a more detailed granular level, or utilizations or whatever, will be provided easily by carriers, because these are more sensitive data. I can see another question. What are the best, from Josh, what are the best term structures for integrating BAF into contracts when informed by VesselBot? The best terms and structures, as I was saying, we have an index. You can build the index to correlate the index, our index, with the fuel surcharges, instead of correlating to Platts bunker prices merely, or leaving it blank to the carriers to decide what they'll charge you. So I would say that is from what we see, the most easy angle to try to negotiate with your carriers.
Yeah. Very good, Constantine. We'll go further with the question. I just did have one remark to your previous comment there, right? I mean, like I mentioned before, we do have kind of historical experience, not necessarily on the ocean side, but on the over-the-road side, where we started doing this over 20 years ago. We obviously in the beginning had a little bit similar frictions maybe with the carriers, but now people understand. And to be honest, on the carrier side, on the over-the-road side, carriers saw it as additional revenue they could charge, right? And additional profitability. But you know what? When you overcharge, it typically doesn't end very well from a long-term relationship with your shipper. So I think it is in everyone's interest to be more collaborative around it, to do it based on real data, and then you have all the information to build new contracts based on that. Now, another question we have here, Constantine, as we'll continue on the Q&A, and please send in your questions. We see that different carriers that often serve the same trade lane can quote significantly different surcharge levels. So can your platform see and compare and then explain the differences?
Yeah, because it's a nice question, by the way. Yes, and the way that we do it, as I was saying before, we know on a service level who is operating the lane, the service, and when carriers use a common reference or for the trade lane, or we know that they're sharing the same vessel and capacity, then we can indicate to our customers which are those carriers, what they are charging on that specific service. They are all sharing the service codes, and as a result, be able to compare even their own proposed charges, not just ours, but also their own published rates on fuel surcharges. So
yeah, we have another really good question here, Constantine. So some companies might not deal directly with the carrier, but rather go through a freight forwarder for their ocean freight, right? Does the industry, the independent surcharge benchmark, does it still provide value in that scenario? And how would the shipper use it when they don't necessarily have that direct contractual relationship with the ocean carrier?
I would guess that this is a pass-through cost. I mean, the freight forwarder is being charged by the carrier. The freight forwarder passes the cost to the shipper. To some extent, some of the cost is included into the freight cost they give them, which is a more all-inclusive cost, and the additional freight surcharges are being charged on a pass-through cost, as a pass-through cost. So it is the same principle, Bart. Instead of managing that through directly with your carrier, you negotiate with your freight forwarder, and at some point of time, the freight forwarder in the next contract will need to, if they have exposure, they'll need to manage that with their carrier as well, and what they are passing them through, because the more shippers are engaging with their freight forwarders, asking for clarifications, pushing back on these costs, they'll drive, the downward effect of the spiral effect of the freight forwarder also negotiating that with their the carrier that is offering the service. Plus, in many cases, you don't know who the carrier is. So you're booking something with the freight forwarder, you don't know who they work with on lanes or who they use. So going back and having visibility on a more generic basis from us can also give you insights on the cumulative trade lane and fuel surcharge that you should be expecting. So you can also manage that as well. So it is a twofold, if you like, way that it can work, especially with freight forwarders.
Yeah, very good. We have another question here. You talked earlier, Constantine, about emergency fuel surcharges. How does the digital twin simulation allow a shipper to verify if that EFS reflects actual voyage execution rather than just a bunker price index?
We have the ability to calculate the cost. As I was saying, I was trying to explain earlier on, we simulate the whole executional level. There is no much information provided by carriers. So, it is a blank statement number from the carrier base that we compare with the more factual data that we provide. And this is the benchmark that enables the shippers to work with carriers to negotiate that. So on one hand side, there's visibility and granularity. On the other hand side, it is a blank statement cost, if you like, in a sense that the carrier releases, and in most cases, the shippers accept. So.
Very good. I think, Maria, that's all the questions we have for now, but if you have any more, we'll give you some contact details at the end of the webinar, so you can definitely send in some of our, some new questions as well. So maybe let's, as we're getting to the end, let's close the webinar by defining some clear next steps. So Constantine, what is one action that shippers can take today, or maybe by latest tomorrow, to really start questioning their BAF exposure?
Look, what I would suggest is look into your financials and see the cost exposure that you had in the last 2 months. What is the cost, the additional cost due to freight, fuel surcharges that you've been charged on all your transportation modes? And that will give you a very good indication of what is this additional cost that you are faced with, and should drive you to understand whether this is an important cost that you should be managing or not. You might decide that it is not, but the first step, I usually suggest that go back, see on your own financials, what is the cost, what is the accumulation over the last year of this year, last year maybe, and understand the exposure, and you will be amazed by the magnitude of that exposure, and then you will be more persuaded to drive changes and do a few steps to manage that.
And Constantine, from a practical perspective, once they have that understanding, and I think some of the listeners might already have that, right? What do they do to get started on this journey? How do they really get started by getting the data, start acting on it?
For us, it's very easy. You can, if they want to work with us, of course, you just email us or reach out through our website, and it's just a matter of registering on our platform, and you start getting data day one. So very fast, very easy process, no hassle at all. We can walk you through, you can see the data, you can try the data, and then you can decide on the next steps. But it's zero barrier to entry, in the sense that there's no technical requirements. There's nothing that you need to do apart from registering. So pretty easy process.
Very good. And if anyone on the call is visiting Gartner Supply Chain Symposium in Barcelona next week, you're going to find Constantine there. So grab him by the neck and just ask all your questions and see how it can help. So Constantine, I want to thank you for sharing these great insights. And I also want to thank the audience for attending, and obviously also for their great questions. And so if you want to know more about this approach and how the platform works, here's the emails that you can go to reach out if you want to get in touch with VesselBot. So with that, I want to conclude the webinar. Thank you for attending. We're going to see you on the next webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.